Recording. So,
Okay.
yes, hello. Good morning to everyone in Latin America. Good afternoon to those who joined us from Europe, and good evening to the late birds in Asia participating in today's webinar. And well, welcome to the second webinar in our online discussion series on climate risk assessments, organized for the International EbA Community of Practice in collaboration with the Sector Network Rural Development in Asia. Both webinars within this discussion series focus on how to conduct climate risk assessment under the risk concept as defined by the fifth assessment report, the AR5, by the members of the IPPC, which adapt the language of the disaster risk reduction community. And just as a reminder for those who couldn't attend the first webinar, the first session on 24th of October focused on climate risk assessment in an adaptation context in general and also in the NAP policy context, and gave insights in the recently published risk supplement to the GIZ vulnerability sourcebook, and exchanged also country insights on risk assessment for land use planning in the Philippines. Well, and those who didn't attend this session, there are recordings available, for example, on adaptationcommunity.net. In today's session, we will now focus on climate risk assessments specifically for ecosystem-based adaptation. And with this, let's have a closer look on the agenda. First, there will be a very short input on, as a community news, on the second International EbA Community of Practice workshop, which was held end of August, with a lot of country representatives from 22 countries and think tanks in Bangkok. And this input will be shared by Matthias Bertram from GIZ. And then we have a detailed expert input on climate risk assessments for ecosystem-based adaptation. And I'm very much looking forward to the inputs from Zita Sebes-Vari and Michael Hagenlocher, both from United Nations University. And then we do have some room for discussion for question and answer sessions. Well, and my name is Alexandra Köngitter. I'm an advisor to the GIZ Global Project Mainstreaming EbA, funded by the Federal Ministry of Environment from Germany. So, before diving deeper into the contents, just some housekeeping. All your microphones have been muted, so if you do have any questions, problems, or comments, you're well advised to use the chat function. You can see your control panel on the left-hand side or on the right-hand side, and that you have the option to raise your hand and to ask to be unmuted. Please be aware that this webinar is being recorded and will be published on adaptationcommunity.net afterwards, together with the first webinar of the online discussion series. And with this, I would already hand over to the first input or the first update on and the news on the second International EbA Community of Practice workshop in Bangkok by Matthias. Matthias.
Matthias, please, can you speak?
Matthias?
Yes, hello.
Ah, yeah, okay, now it's working. Fine, thank you.
Okay, apologies for the technical difficulties. So, yes, welcome everybody. Greetings from Bonn, which is getting ready for the COP23 in the coming weeks. So we are just in the middle of the climate change negotiations, and we would like to share with you some details, some feedback from our second international EbA Community of Practice workshop, which was conducted between the 21st and 24th of August in Bangkok, and where more than 70 delegates from governance, research, and policy institutions, as well as civil society, came together from more than 22 countries. So it was in fact one of the biggest events and conferences on ecosystem-based adaptation this year. And I think many of you will also join the climate change conference here in Bonn in the coming weeks. So the workshop in Bangkok was structured around plenary and parallel discussion sessions, and was centered along 4 core objectives: how to identify entry points for ecosystem-based adaptation mainstreaming, how to monitor and evaluate the results of EbA measures, how to finance EbA measures in the future, and how we can assess and communicate evidence of EbA effectiveness, social and environmental benefits. And some lessons learned from these sessions I would like to share with you now. So with regards to entry points for EbA mainstreaming, there was a clear consensus that both the NDCs and the national adaptation plans are key entry points for EbA at a policy level, but when it comes to subnational level, the entry points are manifold. They can range from ecosystem restoration activities in man-made environments to the protection of pristine or natural ecosystems, from local to national initiatives. And when it comes to funding, using a mixture of public funds or private funding initiatives, because EbA is a landscape approach, as we know, and it requires a multi-sector and multi-actor engagement over long time periods. And this is, of course, also a challenge for financing. There was a lot of discussion about how to finance EbA projects in the long run. It is very important to sustain and upscale and mainstream EbA. This requires significant funding from public sources, but also from private sources. And the private sector seeks for a motivation to enable its involvement in EbA initiatives, but also needs clear incentives to contribute to that. So it's a common and joint effort between the public funds and the private sectors. When it comes to M&E, the monitoring and evaluation of EbA, it is very crucial to demonstrate short, medium, and long-term benefits of EbA, what works in terms of ecosystem-based adaptations. We know there are barriers in terms of providing EbA benefits in the short term. Often we have to restore heavily degraded ecosystems, and the benefits for EbA manifold only in the medium to long run. And also for the communication of EbA effectiveness, it is very crucial to achieve additional financing and upscaling of EbA, and also to communicate its effectiveness to decision makers in the future by assessing monetary and non-monetary values of the projects. The community concluded that the communication of EbA beyond the green sector is still perceived as a challenge, and it is crucial to develop suitable communication tools, let's say for engineers, for planners, for funders, but also capacity building formats at various levels of governance to further mainstreaming and upscale EbA into other sectors or at other levels. One particular session focused on the assessment of risks in the context of ecosystem-based adaptation. This session was facilitated by our colleagues from EURAC Research and United Nations University. So we are very happy that they will in this webinar present some elements of the new guidebook for climate risk assessment in the context of EbA. And if you are interested in more details about our second EbA Community of Practice workshop in Bangkok, you will find more details on adaptationcommunity.net and on Global Campus 21. In our Community of Practice space, you will find all the presentations and a summary of the discussions. So this was just a short feedback on our second EbA Community of Practice workshop, and the third one is coming up next year in June in South Africa. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you very much, Matthias, for sharing these insights and on the outcomes and on the overall workshop in general, and also for highlighting that there was indeed a session on climate risk assessments, and that the comments were selected or concluded by the EbA Community of Practice and were fed into the risk supplement, which is now going to be presented in the upcoming 20 to 25 minutes by Michael and Zita. Michael, Zita, and Fabrice, are you in the line? Yes, I think. Michael, can you hear me?
Yes, now you
Okay.
can, I think.
Great. And I can hear you. This is great. So thank you. I will hand over to you. And well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the very nice introduction. Just one question. Can you see the mouse? So can I use my mouse to highlight something on the slide? Can you see it?
Well, I at the moment can't see it. I somehow think we are still sharing my screen and need to switch to your screen.
Okay.
Is it correct?
Yes.
Yeah, because okay, so right now Michael's screen is being shared.
So again, back to the question, can you see my mouse?
Yes, right now we can see it.
Okay, then good afternoon to everyone, and thank you very much for the very nice and warm introduction. From the outset, I would like to start with the recognition that whatever we are presenting today, it has been done in cooperation with URAC research. Colleagues from URAC couldn't make it today to the webinar, but it's very crucial to mention the involvement in all the results we are presenting today on our work related to the development of the EbA guidebook, which was commissioned by GIZ Global Project Mainstreaming EbA. So today's presenter are Dr. Michael Hagenlocher, who will overtake the second part of the presentation, and myself, Zita Sebesvári. We are both with United Nations University, working in the Environmental Vulnerability and Ecosystem Services section of the Institute, and we are based in Bonn, and very happy to be here with you today. If you allow me, I would take one step back, so zooming out a bit from the EbA context. So why do we actually use climate risk assessments in adaptation planning at all? So it's has been shown it's a very structured and standardized way to actually identify key drivers of vulnerability, potential adaptation measures, and because it can be done in a spatially appropriate matter, spatially explicit matter, it can be also helpful in order to define appropriate locations where those measures could be actually implemented best. It can deliver also guidance for adaptation, but since we are using the risk concept, it can help also in terms of disaster risk reduction, planning and prioritization, which means that this also extends the potential target group who could use this EbA guidebook. It also represents one way of monitoring and evaluation of adaptation measures, and we will also reflect on this at the end of the presentation. So the next slide is to show you that we are not starting from scratch. So there is the very well recognized and used vulnerability source book, which was developed by Adelphi URAC on behalf of GIZ. And this is used actually in IPCC's ER5 for vulnerability assessment methodologies. This was then updated, and this is already mentioned by Alexandra, shortly, it received the so-called risk supplement, which uses the IPCC AR5 risk assessment methodology. And this is our baseline where we are operating with our guidebook, which uses this climate risk assessment methodology in the context of ecosystem-based adaptation. On the next slide, it's a quite busy slide, but I would like to guide your attention to the words which are in bold. So the guidebook specifically looks at social-ecological systems, and this is crucial because in order to identify ecosystem-based solutions, we need to consider the ecosystem in a very systematic and consistent way. So in all the risk assessment elements, we have to actually include ecosystem considerations. This will allow us to identify so-called adaptation packages. We coined this word actually for the EbA guidebook because we think that in many cases, adaptation will be more successful if we combine ecosystem-based and conventional options. And the risk assessment methodology guides you in identifying those adaptation packages very nicely. We do this in a way that we use an illustrative application example throughout the guidebook. And this helps users actually to better understand the steps involved and provide a concrete example so you can actually better imagine what are the steps to do. So if we are looking at the next slide, this provides visualization of the adaptation mainstreaming cycle. And what you see in green are the parts of the cycle which are mainly tackled in this guidebook. So starting with the first one, which states that we have to apply a climate change perspective and an ecosystem lens, which is mainly tackled in module 1 of this guidebook. Then the actual climate risk assessment is done in the modules 2 to 8, leading to module 9, which is identifying adaptation options. And this is a very interesting part of the guidebook and probably the most interesting in terms of it's a clear addition to the vulnerability source book and provide practical help how those adaptation options can be identified. We have some consideration on monitoring and evaluation, although this is probably not at the core of the guidebook, at the present guidebook. So going right to module 1, which is called preparing the risk assessment. What you need to do there is to understand the context of the assessment you would like to do in the context of ecosystem-based adaptation, identify your objective and expected outcomes, determine the scope, and to prepare an implementation plan. Now in the guidebook, we reflect on all these steps using our application example. Here, given the time constraints, I can only highlight some of the elements. So we see here application example of a river basin with 6 districts. The major risk is actually the risk for loss of lives and damage of property due to flooding. And the aim of our assessment is to determine the risk of damage of property and loss of lives due to flooding, which will include EbA, but also conventional adaptation measures, and we'll have a look at the co-benefits and drawbacks of those measures while implementing. So with that, I would turn to module 2, which is the development of impact change. And if some of you came across the vulnerability source book, you might know that it's turned out to be probably the most powerful part of the source book in terms of engagement with stakeholders and how you can actually map out all the relevant hazards, impacts, and vulnerabilities, which helps and guide your risk assessment thereafter. So it's an analytical tool, and in our setting, it has to be recognized that we need to go for a socio-ecological system perspective, which has implications. So if we look at the vulnerability part here, for example, it's clearly stated that we look at ecological sensitivity and social sensitivity, which emphasizes that in this approach, you need to have an understanding of both. So the impact chain starts actually at the end with identifying what kind of risk you want to focus on. It's in the second steps, look at the hazards which might lead to that risk. It's trickled down through intermediate impacts, and it's influenced by the exposure and by the vulnerability, which altogether combines to a specific risk of your social ecological system to a given hazard. So to make it a bit less theoretical, I will show you now the related steps in our application example. So you remember we are now in this river basin with the 6 districts, and during the scoping phase, we identified risk of damage of property and loss of lives due to flooding as the main risk we would like to focus in our assessment. This has now implications for the hazard we want to look at. So our hazard speaks to the risk we are focusing on, and this is identified as actually too much precipitation in the monsoon season or too much precipitation in the dry season. In the next step, we focus on vulnerability, and I will take now a little bit more time to guide you through the vulnerability constituents of risk. So your hazard causing actually a too high water level, which has several implications, and now I only focus on erosion as one of the implications, one of the intermediate impacts. So erosion is not only driven by too high water levels, but also through a reduced erosion protection of the area. We consider this as an ecosystem service, so erosion protection as a service, and reduced erosion protection as one feature of the area which leads to enhanced erosion. And this fact that this ecosystem service is reduced, this is driven by several other factors, one of them being deforestation. Deforestation is caused by a lack of protected forest areas, so there's actually allowed for people to chop down the wood. On the other hand, that there's a very strong dependency on agricultural income in the population, so there's a need for more agricultural land in this application example, so that people are actually chopping down the forest in order to use it for agricultural production. So that highlights nicely how an interplay between social factors and ecosystem factors influences the ecosystem service, here erosion protection, which then influences the intermediate impacts. And then it influences the risk. Going one step further, we need to determine the exposed elements. And again, this is happening in relation to the risk we are looking at. We are looking at risk of damage of property and loss of lives due to flooding. So the exposed elements speak to that. We have people living in flood-prone areas, properties and buildings, as well as critical infrastructure, all in the flood-prone area. Just imagine if we would look at risk, which is related, for example, to agricultural production. The exposure box would also contain some ecosystem elements, such as agricultural fields, for example, so that here the social and ecosystem part would be mirrored.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sita. Good afternoon and a warm welcome also from my side. Michael Hagenlocher speaking. I will guide you through the second part of the presentation. So after you have in module number 2 defined in very close collaboration with relevant stakeholders in your case study area, after you have defined the impact chain, actually the next step would be to identify appropriate and valid indicators to represent the different components of your conceptual framework. So exposure of the social ecological system, the hazards, but also vulnerability of the social ecological system. And here again, I want to emphasize that ideally this should not be something that is happening in closed rooms with no interaction with relevant stakeholders, but again, this should be a highly participatory process involving key experts in the different relevant domains. So let's be a little bit more specific. So if you look at the application example and we start with the hazard component, and Sita has already talked about some of the drivers. So here, one of the drivers that was identified was too much precipitation in the wet season. And an indicator to actually represent this driver could be the number of days with precipitation above 100 millimeters or more. And of course, we can do this not only for the hazard component, but we can also do it for the other components of our social ecological system. And if we now look at some of the factors that actually drive vulnerability of the social ecological system, you can see, and for example, here I have highlighted the example of deforestation that Sita has just talked about. You can see that we can also identify indicators for these factors. And if we stick with deforestation for the moment, you can see that one of the indicators that was identified in this consultation process was actually the percentage of area covered by natural forests in the different districts and in the catchment in general. And this indicator would allow you not only to make an assessment of the current state of forest coverage in your study area, but also would allow you to track changes in forest coverage. But we can also look at some of the more socioeconomic factors. So for example, one of the factors that was mentioned by the experts was people lacking financial resources and this contributing to vulnerability. And here an indicator could be, for example, to take the percentage of the population with income below the national poverty line. And after you have identified these different indicators, what we usually do is we would compile these indicators in a table, as you can see it here. And in this table, I want to draw your attention to this column which says direction. And why is this important? So if we compare the two indicators that I have just highlighted before, you can see that we have a minus here for forest coverage and a plus for vulnerability, for poverty. So what does it mean? It actually means that if we look at forest coverage, that if we have high percentage of forest coverage in your study area, this high percentage actually would decrease your vulnerability. So that's why we have a minus here. And in contrast, if we look at the poverty-related indicator, the percentage of the population with income below the national poverty line, here, if we have a high percentage, naturally, this would increase the vulnerability in your study area. And this has very important implications later in the more technical part of your risk assessment when you normalize the indicators, and I will quickly talk about it when I talk about module number 5. So this is something that you have to bear in mind when you compile the indicators. You also need to reflect on what is their association with vulnerability. A next step after you have identified your indicators is, of course, that we want to acquire and access relevant data sets to actually feed these indicators and enable a quantitative assessment of vulnerability and risk. And here we have to remember that EbA is a landscape approach, and this has implications. This means that ideally, vulnerability and risk assessments should apply a spatial perspective, and consequently, also the data that we want to integrate into our assessment should be spatial explicit data. And I think it's clear, but I just want to underscore it once again. Ideally, we should also try to get and acquire data for all the indicators that were mentioned by the experts and that were highlighted in your impact chain. But of course, we all know that oftentimes we do these assessments in data scarce environments, with limited data availability, where we also have to work with proxy indicators. And the map here is just for illustration purposes. So coming back again to our river basin, this is a land use map derived from remote sensing, and we have highlighted one of the land cover classes, forest coverage, since this was one of the indicators that both Sita and I spoke about earlier. And you could use, for example, such a data set to derive spatially explicit information on forest coverage, here highlighted in green, in the different districts. And I will come back to this example in the next slides. This slide actually summarizes some of the more technical parts of the assessment, which will be reflected in module number 5 to 7 of our EbA guidebook. And I've summarized these modules on one slide because these steps here, we actually follow the vulnerability sourcebook and the risk supplement approach. So there is not too much new in here. But the key question actually that is of interest here is actually, now that we have our indicators and we have the associated data sets, how do we actually combine them into an index? And there is two key steps we need to consider. One is we need to normalize the data to make them comparable. Why is that? Sometimes you might be in a situation where you have to work with land use classes, which are maybe categorical, or you have an indicator which is represented in numbers and another one which is percentages. And in order to make them comparable and integrate them in the risk assessment, we need to normalize them. Also, then once we have normalized them, maybe we want to give them different weights, and there are different methods out there. You could use equal weights or expert judgment, for example, and then combine the weighted and normalized indicators into an index using different aggregation methods. These are the key steps. I don't want to go into all the details of the equations that you can see here. And these are only a few options out of many, because this is described in a lot of detail in the vulnerability sourcebook. And again, it will be mentioned in the EbA guidebook, which is currently under review. Once you have conducted your risk assessment, of course, one important point is the presentation and the interpretation of the outcomes of the results. And here, I think maps and diagrams, graphics, but also narratives can play a very important role in conveying some of the key messages of the risk assessment and helping you to identify adaptation options. And let me give you a few quick examples. So of course, we have that final risk index, which we can visualize using, for example, different shades of red, but we can also make use of the strength of an index-based approach, and that is that we build the index based on indicators, so we can also decompose it back into the indicators and into the components. So we can not only visualize the risk index, but we can also look at the different components, for example, hazard, exposure, and vulnerability, or the underlying indicators. And why is that important? So let's quickly look at district number 3 and district number 6. So they both feature similarly high risk levels, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the underlying indicators or the drivers of risk are the same for both districts. And that has implications when we think about adaptation and EbA in particular, because different measures and options might be needed actually to tackle the risk, the underlying root causes of risk in these two different districts. And that is why it is important to maybe also look at the role of the different indicators and the risk profiles for these different districts. So Sita has already indicated that one of the novelties of the EbA guidebook is that we added the module number 9, which deals with the identification of EbA options, which is of course the main interest of, I guess, many of you listening in today. And here it is of course important to remember that in order to do so, first of all, we need to be clear on the initial adaptation goals and the decision context, and that is something where guidance is provided in module 1. Impact chains, actually, as Sita has presented them in module 2, can actually provide a first guidance to identify key drivers of vulnerability, but also to identify entry points for adaptation. So if you think about the factor deforestation that Sita has mentioned, of course, immediately it becomes obvious in the impact chain that deforestation is contributing to increased flood risk. In this illustrated application example. And therefore, for example, one of the EbA measures, amongst others, could be to focus on afforestation or reforestation in order to tackle that flood problem. But the question is, why did we not stop after the impact chain? So why the risk assessment? And I think this is where the spatial planning and prioritization comes into play, and the need for spatial information. So while the impact chain can help you to actually map out entry points for adaptation, and including here both conventional measures such as dikes or etc., and EbA measures, the risk assessment actually can help you, and the spatial information can help you to identify areas where the EbA measures are most needed in order to have an effect. So here we could use, for example, the vulnerability and risk maps, but also maps of key ecosystems and their services to facilitate this discussion on planning and prioritization of EbA. And out of the risk assessment, actually two options arise. So you can either focus on high-risk areas. So you do a risk assessment, you focus on high-risk areas, and then you try to restore ecosystems in order to make sure that they can provide regulating services in order to tackle the risk in your study area. Or you say, well, let's focus in parallel on those areas that currently have a low vulnerability, and let's conserve what is already there in terms of ecosystems and services in order to keep the vulnerability level low. And I just want to mention that priority should be given to those measures that have effects at both the local and the landscape level. So what do I mean by this? If we think about the forest coverage example again, so if you have a reforestation program, of course this will have effects very locally, but if you have it upstream by reducing erosion and sedimentation and thus flood risk, it also has an effect downstream, so at the entire catchment or at the landscape scale. Sita mentioned the term adaptation packages, and here we just want to refer to the fact that EbA should be part of an overall adaptation strategy, and that's why we think that we need, for sustainable adaptation, we need both conventional and ecosystem-based measures. And why is that? So let's come back to this example with the forest coverage. So here, for example, you can see in District 1 and in District 2, we identified that here, maybe if we have an afforestation or reforestation program, we might be able to reduce some of the flood risk problem downstream. But what if the livelihoods, or maybe some of the informal livelihoods in that part of the catchment, depend on selling wood? Then the afforestation or reforestation measure alone would not be very sustainable, because people would cut the trees in the long run. So that is why we need these adaptation packages, where actually afforestation and reforestation combined with maybe livelihood diversification would be the more successful choice. Two last slides I would like to briefly discuss is we all know that EbA can provide additional co-benefits next to the direct adaptation benefits. And here we just want to emphasize that the impact chains, again, can help to actually systematically consider the adaptation benefits, potential co-benefits, but also drawbacks. And I would like to draw your attention here to wetland degradation as a factor and wetland restoration as a potential EbA measure. And you can see that this could have a direct adaptation benefit affecting the natural retention capacity, for example, by increasing groundwater storage. But next to these direct adaptation benefits, you can also then look at your impact chain and think about potential co-benefits. And one example would be that wetland restoration, of course, could have an effect on biodiversity in your catchment, which could have an effect on fish and birds in your catchment, and could even lead to more tourism and additional income, so tackling some of the other drivers of vulnerability. But of course, it's also important to mention that wetland restoration, like other EbA measures, can have drawbacks or unintended consequences. For example, if you implement this in tropical or subtropical regions, this could be a habitat for vector-borne diseases, which then potentially could have an effect on good health and well-being. And to conclude, I just would like to share some initial thoughts on how risk assessments could be used for M&E. Those of you who attended the workshop in Thailand know that this was a very heavily debated topic. And here we believe that initial risk assessments actually can provide baselines. So if you look at the risk today, we can have a baseline. And then if we do repeated risk assessments, for example, over certain intervals, 3 or 5 years, while implementing the EbA measure, actually we can analyze the changes in risk in the underlying components, but also in some of the indicators. But here it is important, and I want to make this very clear, that a one-to-one attribution of, for example, reduced levels of risk or vulnerability might not be, or it's difficult to directly associate these to your EbA measure, because there might be, of course, other factors like global market developments, etc., which might have an effect on risk patterns in your catchment. And with this, I would like to thank, first of all of you for your attention. But I also want to underscore once again that this is work that has been done with colleagues, Dr. Mark Zebisch, Dr. Stefan Schneiderbauer, and Ms. Katrin Renner from Europe Research, who unfortunately cannot be with us today. I would also like to thank them for the fantastic collaboration in GIZ, of course. And with this, we're very much looking forward to your question and the remaining discussion time. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Michael and Zita, for this excellent presentation and detailed presentation on this complex topic, risk assessments for ecosystem-based adaptation, and also, Michael, for sharing your thoughts on what we discussed in Bangkok, for example, on M&E. And with this, I think there might be already a lot of questions from the participants, and I would open the first round of questions. All clarification questions, but also comments and well, further questions for discussions are welcome. And as said in the beginning, how could you engage in the discussions? You do have the control panel on your right-hand side, and there is a function questions, so there you can type your questions and we will try to answer them separately. Or if for any reason you would prefer to ask your question live, then please raise your hand so we can unmute your microphone and well, and we can address your questions in this way. So, well, we would open the first round. I see there's no question yet. The box is on the right-hand side. You might have received my question from 3:43. This is a box where to answer or where to ask your questions. Okay, there's a question from Celia. Thank you, Michael and Zita, for this interesting presentation. Does the guidebook provide any guidance on the costs of EbA and how cost effectiveness of different practices should be taken into account? Michael and Zita, I would hand over to you once again.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. It's actually a very relevant one. So in the guidebook, we will have an additional short chapter where we actually reflect exactly on this question, although it's not a topic of this guidebook alone. I think it could be a topic for another guidebook. So the question is, how do we, after we have identified the options and how we have maybe spatially prioritized different options, how do we evaluate cost benefits, etc.? And here what we want to share is that we think it's very important to not only look into cost benefit analysis, which of course is tricky. If we think about, for example, also including how can we include some of the co-benefits into this estimation. But I think it's also increasingly important, and it's very essential to look at how socially acceptable, how culturally acceptable, how politically feasible are some of these options. And this is something that we will reflect on in the guidebook as well.
Yeah, just to add on this, as Matthias already mentioned, we are also working with the EbA community of practice on an evaluation source book on exactly this, how to value the costs, benefits, and impacts. And this guidebook will also be published soon. Thank you very much for this first question. And we come to the next by Florencia. I'm wondering how and when do you analyze other key drivers of change? Michael and Zita, I would hand over to you.
It is part of the impact chain discussion to look at the drivers. In our example impact chain, it was not displayed, but it is again something which is changing with time. So it would be kind of part of this repeated risk assessment cycle, which we consider as a kind of adaptive management approach, which is then supported by the risk assessment. And drivers need to be one part of the discussion in all the stakeholder consultations.
Maybe to add quickly on it, of course you can, the way we define the indicators, they enable you to do a quantitative assessment of present day conditions, but they should be designed in a way that they enable you to track changes. For example, in forest coverage, for example, in poverty, in governance, etc., etc. And of course, we provide a standardized methodology, so it can be used for repeated assessments, but of course, you could also use it to look into, for example, what would happen under different scenarios. This would be feasible with this methodology, but it depends again on the scope of your assessment.
Okay, thank you very much. There's another question, also from Celia. Does the guidebook provide any information on how long the process of assessing risk and identifying appropriate EbA practices takes, and how much it would cost to go through this standardized methodology?
Yeah, maybe I am starting with the answer, and then Michael might come in if you have additional comments. So I think it's very much depending on the resources available and also on the data which is already there. So in an area where data is generally available and the main task is to do actually the impact chain and then identify the indicators, collect available data and do the assessment. This can be done in basically 1 month. I'm not referring it to working on it full-time 1 month, but so it can be quite quick. But of course, depending on the indicators you selected and depending on data availability, this can be an exercise which takes several months up to a year, I would say. So it's difficult to answer without having the exact context.
Maybe something that I can share is we mentioned already that our colleagues from URC were involved in shaping the vulnerability sourcebook, and the vulnerability sourcebook was actually initially designed to also support assessment where people sit with a sheet of paper and a pen to do a quick, rapid assessment, for example, sending people to a community and doing an assessment there. So this would then could be done in a matter of maybe weeks. But here, again, we have to remember it's a landscape approach. Ideally, you would do a spatial assessment, and this is usually, talking out of experience, nothing that can be easily done in such a short time. So for example, for the application example, we tried to estimate the time it would take to do such an assessment. And if you want to do it properly, something like this can take easily up to 6 months to a year.
Okay, thank you very much. I see there are more questions related on the time and resources for doing the risk assessment. I think this has been answered already, but there's another question, this time from South Africa. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. May you explain more on the stakeholder consultative process, what levels of capacity in climate change knowledge do you engage with when conducting public participation?
Yeah, thank you very much for the excellent questions. So I think we've emphasized it multiple times that this should be a highly consultative, participatory process, particularly the impact chain development and the indicator definition. And what is important here is, I think, it's less the knowledge on climate change adaptation, but it's important to have people in the room who are experts on the different domains that are relevant when we talk about adaptation and EbA in particular. So when we talk about flood risk, for example, you can already see by looking at the different components, exposure, vulnerability, and hazards, that this requires a multidisciplinary perspective on the topic. And this means that ideally you would also have experts with different backgrounds, people who have a very good understanding of the state of ecosystems and their services in your catchment, people who have a very good understanding of socioeconomic conditions in your study area and the political environment, people who maybe bring in additional expertise in hazard mapping or modeling, maybe even climate change scenarios. And of course, what is very relevant, that this shouldn't be an academic exercise. So out of experience, it's very good if you have representatives coming from different backgrounds, including academia, government, other stakeholders such as NGO, and perhaps even representatives, or ideally, depending on the scale and scope of the assessments, representatives from communities at risk.
Thank you very much. I think we will take one more final question with regard to time. There's one on M&E. Regarding the M&E, as you already mentioned, it will be difficult to attribute the improvements to EbA measures. How can or will you ensure that risk decreased because of EbA?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Thank you very much. And I think at this time, we do not have a clear answer on it. So we would like to highlight that in a way that you are doing this repeated risk assessment, you can actually monitor the risk situation in the area, and you can also detect which part of risk, so is it the exposure or is it the vulnerability, and which elements of those are changing. Sometimes this will give you a clear hint that it is related to your EbA measure, but in many other cases, the linkages will be not that clear. The question is if that is actually a problem and how far it is. So if you think about precautious measures you are implementing, so you could see this as one element contributing to risk reduction, and how you are defining the exact contribution. It's I would fear it will be really difficult to kind of put it in a percentage share. Like, I don't think you will come up at the end with 20% of this risk reduction is attributable to your EbA measure and 5% to economic development and so on. So I would be skeptical if that can be achieved. But if you are implementing your measures, you are delivering on the co-benefits, and you are seeing with your repeated risk assessment that actually the situation is improving in your area, probably you already achieved a lot. I am looking at Michael if he has a further comment on this.
No, just very quickly, I think you're pointing actually at something where we really need further research on the evidence and on M&E of EbA. I think this is actually currently one of the hot topics. If I remember the discussions in Bangkok, it was one of the most hotly debated topics during this event, and I think there is still some work that needs to be done in that direction.
Okay, thank you for this, for your answer, and also for sharing your thoughts. And M&E and evidence of EbA. I think we will address these topics further with the International EbA Community of Practice and also organize further online discussion series on this. The final question is a very nicely comes to my conclusion. It's a question when this EbA guidebook is finally published. And in terms of next steps, yes, the EbA guidebook will be published, for example, on adaptationcommunity.net, where beginning of 2018, January perhaps. And this webinar has been recorded and will be published beginning of next week also on adaptationcommunity.net. And with this, we would also end our short discussion series on climate risk assessment with the second input, and announce upcoming discussion series on Adaptation Community Net and through the distribution letters where you have maybe received the invitations. So thank you very much for joining us today for today's session. And many thanks to Matthias, Zita, and Michael for their very detailed inputs, and to all participants for the active discussion. I see there are a lot of questions. If any further questions should arise, please feel free to contact me via email. You've got my contact details in the invitation email, but also on the first slides. So thank you with this. I would like to end the session with a short